Hello and welcome to the Yale Center for British Art and our online series At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Martina Droth. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the YCBA, and I'm thrilled to welcome the artist Thomas J. Price to our program. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you.
Before we begin our conversation, I just have a few housekeeping notes for our audience. So please note that this program is being recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain muted throughout the program, but there is a Q&A function on your navigation bar. So please do post your questions and we'll get to them at the end. Post your questions at any time as Thomas and I are talking. If anyone would like closed captioning, there is a live transcript available. You just need to click the little CC icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pagussit, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people, have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. So, Thomas J. Price. Thomas Price was born in London. He is a multidisciplinary artist who works across film, photography, and sculpture. So we'll be talking about works in a range of media, and in particular focusing on his large-scale figurative sculptures, which engage with, such pressing and timely issues around interpretation, power, representation. His work has been widely exhibited and internationally exhibited. In 2022, he created Warm Shores for the Hackney Windrush Art Commission, and this was the first permanent public sculpture to celebrate the contributions of the Windrush generation and its descendants in the UK. His first comprehensive solo exhibition in the United States is currently on view at Hauser and Wirth in Los Angeles, and I'm excited to talk about that with him. And he is working on a major forthcoming project at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So, Thomas, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to talk with you, and we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to dive straight in. And in fact, I want to start by talking about the work that we can just glimpse behind you in this title slide, and I have a picture of the whole. This is Warm Shores, which was unveiled just over a year ago on the 22nd of June, 2022. And I'm mentioning the precise date, 22nd of June, because that is Windrush Day in the UK. And just to sort of fill in for our audiences who are not in the UK, the anniversary of the arrival into Tilbury docks of the Empire Windrush from Jamaica, carrying 802 people, happened on the 22nd of June, 1948. And this anniversary became officially recognized as Windrush Day in the UK in 2017. And so now it's marked as an annual day of celebration and recognition of the contributions of the Windrush generation to, and its descendants to life and culture in the UK. Thomas, this was, as I said, the first permanent public sculpture commissioned in honor of the Windrush generation. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the circumstances of this public work. How did the commission come about?
I was contacted by Hackney Council, so where this sculpture stands, these two sculptures stand, who had been for a long time very conscious about their community and about Windrush and the Windrush generation, and they had wanted to celebrate the Windrush generation and descendants for a long time. So they had actually found a way to fund this outside of the government in order to kind of create this opportunity, basically, to celebrate a part of society in the UK who have been, I would say, very badly treated. Just to give you a bit more, for your audience, a bit more history of the Windrush. The Windrush after the Second World War, there were calls put out to the Caribbean to come to the UK to help rebuild, to be part of the UK society. They're told how valued they would be. So there's a lot of people came over with these hugely ambitious hopes of, and thinking that the UK is going to live up to their promise, essentially of integrating and taking pride in this new influx of people who are going to help rebuild the nation. And so this piece is called Warm Shores as a nod to that hope and a nod to the Caribbean itself. But the reality was that they were not welcomed when they got to the UK. In fact, they were, for the most part, treated incredibly badly. They couldn't get housing, jobs were not forthcoming. The treatment was generally just very, very bad, and absolutely against what they were promised. And so really, I think Hackney, and then there'd been subsequently, more recently, is what we have now termed the Windrush scandal, which is the government were trying to send people home who they claimed couldn't prove that they were actually UK citizens. So they may have been perhaps born in Jamaica, for example, but raised, since they were babies in the UK, or they just didn't have the paperwork because the way of keeping records at the time didn't allow for this longevity. And so you have a whole host of people who were basically told they couldn't work, couldn't take benefits, or they couldn't, do anything, and because they weren't British, and they were going to be sent home, inverted commas, to a place that they had never known, experienced. And so basically that the dehumanization that occurred, more recently, I think was matched with or matched what happened at the beginning. And so this is an opportunity, as I call it, it's a celebration as opposed to a monument for me, given the the kind of the connotations of what monuments are and continue to be.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, so I want to pick up on some of those points, but I think it's very interesting what you say, that it's not a monument, it's a celebration. So could you talk a little bit about why you want to not use the word monument in describing your outdoor public sculpture?
Yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to the associations and the power that words have, and because the meaning that they carry. And my understanding of monuments, or my experience of monuments, is that they normally tell official stories, the national official account of something. So to use a slightly provocative word, they're like propaganda. They're to reinforce. They initially instill, then they reinforce a narrative, which is ultimately there to make sure that we adhere to the power structures that exist. And so we look up to a particular kind of type of person or type of people. We celebrate particular events that we're told a certain version of. And they reinforce that, and we become so used to them, so they're normally in certain materials and in certain formats. So you normally have them in bronze, which is why I use bronze for these works. They're normally at a particular scale. They normally incorporate a plinth, so an elevated platform, which shows you that the thing on top of that is something of high value, high status.
Yeah.
And so if you notice, like my works try and counter this, try and critique this on several fronts, but the main one is they stand on the ground. They stand on the grounds that we share with them. So they're not looking over us like these kind of ruling conquerors from a kind of colonial past, but they share our very space. So the sense of scale and difference of scale that we have with them is you register that very quickly. So these ways of using material and not using plinths. And then also very importantly for me, which the viewers might not know, but they're fictional characters. So with the Windrush, with Warm Shores, there are about 30 residents of Hackney who are connected to the Windrush generation, who I met, interviewed, photographed, 3D scanned, and then I composited them together to create these two characters. So there's multiple elements of different people, and also just the experiences, the conversations and the stories that they told me about how they feel about Windrush and being, connected to this legacy and this very undertold story, this I would say undervalued, hugely important, culturally hugely important part of society in the UK, globally, but I would say massively undervalued. And I think to kind of almost use the language of power, the language of acceptance, the language of integration, the language of prominence and basically this high value in a way to tell the story and to show ourselves, to give an example of you being present and being connected to the very fabric of the environment, the very fabric of society. They're on the ground. It's a really potent message. It's a very important one, which I think unless you haven't seen yourself in that kind of way, or someone who looks like you, or people that you value and hold dear, I think you don't perhaps quite understand. Like there's other elements, you know, in terms of their posture, body language, do not assume, again, this conqueror's sort of pose. So it was a way really to give people a chance to feel human.
Yeah. Well, I love what you've just described and how you worked with people in Hackney in making the work. And I think it was, you know, an important point that you made, that this, you know, amidst the celebration and honoring of Windrush is happening within this recent, or maybe that's the wrong word because it's actually ongoing.
I was going to say ongoing, yeah.
And this painful situation whereby the rights and legitimacy of the Windrush generation is suddenly taken away by the actions of the government. And I was interested to see that Hackney Council has been very openly critical of the government's actions and makes quite a strong statement on its website that it's campaigning against the so-called hostile environment policy that the government initiated. So Hackney Council provides a particular context, which is quite distinct from another Windrush monument that was erected by central government in Waterloo. And that, you know, I noticed just reading some of the sort of press responses, it's had a much more mixed reaction because it's seen as hypocritical of the government to, on the one hand, have implemented this hostile environment, and on the other, making these gestures of celebration. And I just wondered how, you know, as an artist, you know, what went through your mind as you know, you were making this work, but you're also seeing how art and sculpture are becoming entangled in these political moments.
Yeah, I think sculpture's always been political because it's normally, you know, it's existed outside. I think, was it like the, you know, the second art form? We had architecture and we had sculpture to adorn the buildings, you know, if you want to go down that kind of accepted history. So in terms of being politicized or being seen to be political, I'm fine with that because I'm using sculpture in a way that engages with those subjects. I think, you know, and for full transparency, I was on the shortlist for the government one. So that would have been quite an interesting situation to be in, to be doing too. But I felt that it was important for me to be on that list and to be involved in their process to try and guide it slightly, because I didn't want it to be, you know, the same kind of thing that we always have. I didn't want it to be this narrative reinforcement of a lie, basically. And I think there is an issue. It's kind of slightly schizophrenic, or yeah, kind of slightly this government having created the situation, this abusive situation, and then also saying, but we love you. Yeah. You know, and it doesn't sit right. Yeah. And I think that, you know, in terms of being critical, I think we have to be honest. I think that's what people really want. They want some honesty. You know, we want to be told the truth. We don't want to be lied to because we know what the reality is. We experience it. So I think, I don't know, you could see it as the way, in one side, you could see it as government trying to make amends, trying to create a better environment for inclusion and for the Windrush generation and descendants. But that would only be right if the other changes were made first. And so to use money to then create a monument without making the other changes, or without paying the you know, the damages essentially, or without paying, you know, kind of compensation to people who were massively mistreated, I think I can understand why people are upset. I'm upset about it. So I understand that dichotomy, that contradiction. But yes, you know, it is good to have these reminders within society that you are valued, that you are seen. But that's only worthwhile, it only really registers in a truthful way if the rest is there as well. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear it. And I want to come back to bronze that you've talked about as it's obviously, as you said, the traditional material for monuments, for creating legacies and ideologies. and you have a very sort of purposeful and deliberate approach to the material. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more how the use of bronze, given
specifically given those associations, how that creates new meanings in your work.
Yeah, I think it's really about kind of subverting the expectations of a material or a format, you know, the formula to the monument, the formula to a statue. You know, I said these are sculptures about statues because they come from a different perspective, or they come from a different angle, and they're trying to talk about these things that we are sort of indoctrinated into accepting and understanding on this sort of intrinsic level. You know, everybody understands that if something's on top of a plinth, it's important, or it should be of significance. And if you don't know why, then that's on you, and you should go and find out why, because this person has done great things. And it's only a matter of discovering what these great things are. When, you know, on a practical level, we know that's not necessarily true. So I wanted to sort of critique and comment upon that state by using the same material. So engaging our understandings of or our associations of the material with power, with legacy, with history, with being official, with being truth, of being significant, and attach it to imagery of people that I found familiar and recognizable, but connect it to fictional people. So it's about using fictional people to create real emotional content, a real emotional contact. Mm-hmm. And to do it on a scale, eventually, I played with scale. Scale is an incredibly important element of my practice, and it's something I use to try and, you know, kind of configure the interaction with the viewer, and and sort of augment the understanding of what the work's bringing to the viewer. So for me, this idea of a fictionalized character in the material that we understand at a scale that we kind of understand, but in a format in terms of the install being on the ground with us, being that uncanny familiar thing, but so it makes us aware of what it's not, you know. So yes. it makes us aware of what we see around us. So then when you walk past one of these monuments of a man on a horse or whatever, in fact, one of my first pieces was called Man on a Horse after Manrini. But you suddenly see it, you know. Otherwise, these things are sort of like silently, as I said before, like silently in the background, but just reinforcing. You know, in an unconscious way, they're kind of reinforcing our understandings, our learned understandings. Because we walk around these as children, we walk around as adults, and we never potentially really question them.
Yes, of course. So you're not only it not only reflects on your own work in the way you sort of reactivate the material in a different way, it also makes us look at the existing statues that are in our midst, look at them fresh. Yeah,
I hope so. I mean, for me, the work has value in that they give a presence, you know. So they're dealing with a lack of visibility. They're dealing with what hasn't been given. So it's taking and making a statement of presence and taking up space in a world which is often still trying to push Black people into the outer edges of society, you know. Yeah. Through access and through all sorts of things. Just through literally being in a social space sometimes, you know, you feel quite vulnerable. You are aware of yourself. So what you're noticing with all the characters I do, they're very much not trying to be performative. They're not trying to prove to you that they're trustworthy. They're not trying to prove to you that they are of high status or they're allowed to be there. They are there. And the other one is, yes, like you said, you know, they make us aware of what already exists and what we've taken for granted or what we've just come to accept. And, you know, there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about monuments, about statues, and about whether or not we accept them. And some people have gone, no longer. You know, that conversation has been going on for a while, obviously, but it got to the point where people started to just take them down. And I think that shows, you know, the extent to which intelligent, law-abiding citizens in any other way will go to when something becomes just too much. And, you know, I think, so now, you know, the subject matter is incredibly potent because of what's happening in society. But I think the discussion has been happening, and I think the awareness has been there. But I think, you know, it came to a head, you know, a few years ago.
Absolutely.
It's been very interesting to talk about it.
Absolutely, yeah, and yes, incredibly timely to look at the work, and we'll look at some other examples in different contexts, which I think is also very interesting. But before we leave this piece, I wanted to ask a question about working in bronze, which is such a technically complicated process, involves a professional foundry. Could you speak a little bit about the process and how you feel your own involvement in the making of a work that's so complicated to make?
Yeah, I mean, I geek out on it. I absolutely love material. Yeah, I say I'm a sculptor because of that innate kind of sensibility about material and kind of the emotion and the understanding it brings. And so my process has changed over the years. You know, from me being in a little studio space with a bit of clay, sort of like creating very detailed small pieces, which I call very dense works, and then working with a team of very clever people to scale up in wet clay by hand. I now use a digital process, which is either using scanned people as elements, which are then resculpted over, like, kind of like a digital armature. So I call it digital clay, digital armature. So that they form the basis, the structure for which I then sort of create sculptures based around, you know, very kind of academic notions or understandings of sculpture and what creates successful sculptures in terms of the rhythm of the piece, in terms of like the amount of detail, the flow, the shape, the form, the silhouette, volume, all that kind of stuff. But also, what's very important for me is the emotional content of it. What does it carry in terms of empathy and understanding of a human condition or human character. So I very much am there sort of trying to sculpt digitally the thing in order to provide the foundries with everything that they need. So ultimately what they then do, which is slightly beyond me how they do it, is they use their incredible skill base to then basically replicate that at a particular scale. And I use very particular scales because you get a different impact. And you get to play with like the distance, the viewing distance, and you know, the kind of the connotations or the associations with different scales. So I work very closely with the foundries and the teams there. So we do digital printing now. So when I have this digital model, we can print out digitally, and then we can, instead of using a wax, so instead of having to make a mold and then make a wax and then coat that in a ceramic shell and then burn that out and then fill it with bronze, we can print out directly in something that can be burnt. We cover that in the ceramic shell. That's burnt out. And then it's just very traditional method from there on. And it's welded together in different pieces, like, you know, 3D jigsaw. But it's incredibly technical. There are welding, you know, the level of skill that, you know, these artisans have is phenomenal. And the amount of understanding and sensitivity they have to, I guess, to me going in there and pointing at stuff and going, can it just be a bit more like this? You know, is incredible. So I have very good relationships with different foundries, different, you know, stone carvers and people like that.
Yeah.
And because I come from a sculpting background, so like, you know, if I could, I'd be on all of them, but I just don't really have the time, or I guess it's the old studio system. You know, it goes back very, very far. The more ambitious you are, the more you have to be able to describe your idea and control that idea to many people. So it's been an interesting sort of learning curve for me for several years now, is to how to make sure that the content is there. And actually what I found is via the digital method, because there's less interpretation through hand build, through a clay process, you actually have an exact thing, but at a different scale. And so it means that you have to project forward. So when you're doing the original, you have to think of it in multiple scales, because there's a change of impact given different forms. So some things work better at different scale, but you can tweak it so that everything works.
And it's so interesting how, you know, you've emphasized the incredible skill and handcraft that's involved, even though we now also have all these digital technologies available. It's still very much a hands-on process that requires incredible skill.
I think sometimes perhaps there's the impression that if you do anything with using any kind of digital method, or that you press play and it's done for you. And it's very much not the case. There's a huge amount of handwork that goes into it. Even just with the digital stuff, I still say it's handwork. You're using a digital environment, but you're doing it effectively with your hands and your eye. And as I say, like, I come from a sculpture background, so I'm not really approaching it like a computer programmer. I could probably use like 3% of what the software can do. I use it like literally like a digital clay box, and I just sort of slap it around, or I work with someone who can then like piece my very messy meshes together so that they're actually printable. Because that then becomes an incredibly technical thing. So like I say, I'm very lucky to be able to work with people who are able to like be in keeping with the vision and not overtread and not sort of try and impose their own kind of vision on it. so that we get, at the end, we get to the, you see on screen here, my hands all
Yeah.
over this thing. But it's, I remember there was a time when I would literally be over something like that on a ladder in wet clay, having to sculpt in by hand each strand, which would then have to be redone in the wax.
Yes, that's
and
right.
now, this could be directly burnt out.
Am I understanding correctly then that these strands that we're seeing in this image, that they're the result of a digital image? They're not modeled.
They're modeled digitally, so they're geometry.
Yeah.
So the first one I did, I use a very inefficient method, but yeah, they're ultimately you can build these kind of these structures, these meshes in the digital realm, and then you can print them out. Then you rework by hand. But it's what I found is that it gives you this amazing freedom to experiment when you start to work digitally. So instead of being this linear process where you're like doing something in clay, and then you make a change, you have to follow that change, and then you make another change, and you go along this singular line. When you do digital, you can actually you can create multiples, and you can experiment, and you can change, you can do comparative kind of sculpts without having to make molds of everything and wait weeks. You can really play around, and it allowed me to push at the nuances of things and to really see what through the subtleties what impact you can have through the experimentation, and allow me to develop the idea of a character more broadly speaking. So it's been a phenomenal way to kind of open up the possibilities and to basically start to explore different ways of representation.
Yeah, I think that's actually really fascinating, this moving from a linear process to something that's much more iterative, because that seems to me a really fundamental shift of possibility in sculpture, which has retained a lot of methods and materials that have kind of stayed the same, but now there's this new opening up. So thank you for sharing that and describing your process. Is really fascinating. I wanted to just continue by just thinking a little bit further about some of these large bronze figures that you've been making. Here's a work that you made in 2021. This was on view at Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. And you've described Harlem as a counterpoint to your own neighborhood in Brixton, and as a place that you know well. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how you feel about the relationship to this site and what you set out to do here.
So yeah, for me, I've been going to New York for about 18, and staying with a friend in Harlem for many years. Probably think too many years. But so Harlem became this place that I'd always visit, and it very much had. I think it's now twinned with Brixton actually subsequently, but it had an immediate familiarity about it in terms of like the neighborhood, the family aspect. It was a predominantly, depending on which part of Harlem, but predominantly Black population. Brixton, it was a lot of, after Windrush, it's where a lot of Black people then settled. People obviously throughout the UK, but there was a huge concentration. And so a place where I grew up feeling at home at, and then seeing the resemblance and the familiarity within Harlem, these things felt connected to me. And now it's nice to know that I think they actually are. And so for me, but there's also, in terms of the more contemporary element or aspects of those locations, you have this idea of gentrification, which is obviously a global happening, but it feels very specific, or it's happening in a very specific way, I think, in Harlem, happening in a very specific way in Brixton. Probably already happened in Brixton. And there's this idea of being pushed out. This idea of these areas which were once highly desirable, and then were sort of less so, and then were allowed for different communities to move in there and actually like set up home and then create this amazing culture and wealth of experience for those locations, which then became desirable again, which then obviously leads to this kind of being economically pushed out. And I think this idea of then having this sculpture which is showing a presence again, it's about being seen in space, being seen in a public space. I think it registers, it resonates in a way perhaps in different ways for different people. But for me, it was very much about a statement of presence and still being there, and being there in on your own terms. And so not being there by way of, again, it's a kind of idea of being performative. This way of presenting yourself in a manner which is acceptable to people outside of yourself, but about embracing, who we are, who these individuals are, and who those individuals are is totally dependent on who's looking at them, which is also what I love about the idea of these fictionalized characters. It's we don't have a secure narrative to locate ourselves in and say, to fall back on and be like, well, then we can flip through Wikipedia or whatever and say this is who it is. We have to bring ourselves to these works and bring our understandings, bring our learnings, bring our attitudes to these works. So in that sense, they sort of like they're exposing us, and I think some people find that sometimes too challenging, even though it's a figure of a person. It's a person standing there. Also got a mobile phone. The mobile phone can become immensely charged in terms of what it is communicating, depending on who you are. The first commission I had, in fact, well, I've had 3 now. My 20-something years. It was rejected on the last moment because it was deemed potentially that the media were going to say it was a criminal. Ultimately, they said a writer, but decided because it was a young black man with a phone, which, and we had the riots in the UK in 2012, and Blackberries, you remember those? They were blamed as this device which people were allowed to use to orchestrate these violent riots. And if you looked at the media, and I certainly noticed, the media were portraying, or everything they would show about the riots would be ultimately showing images of black people, young black people, doing criminal acts. It was a national thing. It was all sorts of people doing this, but they never got shown. And when they were doing like the clearing up element, the getting back to business kind of thing, they only showed images of white people with brooms in their hands. And I remember thinking, this is insane, because I was on my BlackBerry, on a bike, in a puffer jacket, on the phone, checking that my family were okay when I was, during these riots. And so, it's, the level of disappointment and really just being upset about that scenario when it was brought to my attention that this is why. It actually spurred me on to go to a large scale. So this is originally going to be a small piece. So then that's when I first went to 9 feet tall. And that's when I realized the impact that scale has in a public setting, in terms of like your negotiation with your understandings of where you've seen someone like this, where you've seen a format like this, and how you feel in proximity to it.
That's an incredible story that you've just told us. It's incredibly poignant. I love this piece with the phone, and also just looking at the date that this was during COVID. And I feel gives the phone as the point of connection a special resonance. Yeah,
I always think of like a phone like a portal, and it carries so many different potential connotations and meanings. I've been working with phones since, I can do the date, I think it was 2002 in terms of in the work. Is that right? 2002, yeah. I had an animation, stop motion animation, it was a phone. Because I think there is this, we want to connect to people, don't we? We want to be understood. We want to be seen, we want to be understood. We want to feel a connection, and often that's not the case. And I think, for me, this phone brings in so many different layers of that desire to be connected, to be accepted, perhaps, but also by oneself. Like you've got to accept yourself before others can accept you. And when you're being told that you are this or you are that, through media, through the only imagery that you get to see of people like yourself, if it doesn't resonate or doesn't match or doesn't fulfill that real potential that is there, then there's a lack and there's something missing. And I think sometimes you need to see the other thing and also articulate what that thing is that's missing. And for myself, these works, for me, I can't talk for other people, but for me, when I see them in public spaces, I realize, I think, what I was missing when I was younger. And I like that they sort of stand up against or in opposition to limitations.
Yeah.
And they talk about potential. And I mean, it's a great example.
Yeah, exactly. speaks to what you're
but
talking.
it's what other people do with the works. And you know,
Mm.
I make these works from a, you know, an individual perspective with a understanding of now how they are sort of taken on. But this for me was a massive surprise in terms of the number of people that turned out, the way that they showed how this work resonated for them, the way that they took ownership of and just amplified the bits I tried to like imbue it with. It became something totally beyond what I had hoped for. And you know, to have it in such a central location in Rotterdam, and as a way of bringing out, you know, I think these works, you know, depending on where you put them, they bring out what needs to be talked about in those areas, in those communities, and beyond. And I think this 12-foot piece has done that. You know, it's just been in all the newspapers in Europe, and it's really, for a place that thought it was very liberal and accepting, it got a little bit of a reality check, I think, through this work. But then at the same time, it was forward thinking enough and embracing enough of its inhabitants, you know, its residents, to put this work there in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's multiple layers to these things. You know, nothing's ever simple, and I think that's also why it's interesting, because it's not simple. It's not just, you know, binary. It's there's layers, and there's nuances to it all, and history is messy.
Yeah. I just want to point out for people listening in that this has just happened quite recently, and I want to say congratulations. I think this is so exciting. And you know, we've talked about the two other examples of your work that we've looked at. The site, Haarlem, is a place that you know. Rotterdam is this wasn't made for Rotterdam. You know, I want people to know that. But clearly, your work, as you've sort of hinted at, addresses certain themes that can be incredibly relevant in lots of different places. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about, why is this work here? How did this happen? How did it come about?
I mean, this work, you know, for my side of it, this work was purchased during Art Basel, Basel Unlimited. And it was purchased by a group who recognized the potential it had to create a discussion, a very necessary discussion in Rotterdam. It was, you know, it was installed there by them, not by myself. The location was chosen with me. You know, once I was given the different options, this was the one that I was like, yeah, it really needs to go there. And you know, and to their credit, they were able to get that placed there. But really, this has come off the recognition of what these, I guess, these works can provide for cities, for locations, is at this moment of visibility. Because I think we cover up so much, you know, in our own lives, and I think in order to just survive, sometimes you just have to like paper over things, you know, instead of actually dealing with it, you paper over it. And really, these works are about being human.
Yeah.
I think that's what a lot of people, these works, you know, when I first started doing the first figurative piece, it was always about being human. I was making kind of abstract videos and then performance works and stop motion animations, which were about what it means to have empathy, what it means to try and connect to someone. And so I think we recognize this need today, you know, as we get more and more digitized and more removed from one another, or the need to interact in the ways that we are still sort of perhaps evolutionary speaking in keeping with, in line with. As we remove from that more and more, I think, you know, tangible things like sculpture, which then portray people, you know, ideas of people, they resonate in a way which has more impact than perhaps we were expecting, because we're having less of it in our lives, our everyday life.
Yeah.
So, you know, as someone who's always trying to make work about being people, or being a human being, and then who had to take on the idea of race as it was projected onto me and onto my work. So I deal with that projection as opposed to race itself. I'm dealing with the interpretation as opposed to an imagined fact, you know.
That's an interesting distinction. Yeah. There's a group of your large scale bronzes currently on view in Los Angeles. This is so exciting.
Yes.
On until the 20th of August. I hope to see it next month. And I've got a few questions about this, but I wanted to start with, I love this image. Here you are talking to a group of young people. And it made me just wonder if that aspect of making an exhibition, showing works, talking with people, how important that is to you, and whether you're sort of, are you thinking ahead to your visitors when you're making work or putting a show together?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's a difficult question to answer. Yes and no. So I make individual works which I have conversations with. You know, I'm asking questions about, for me, who is this person, and often in relation to previous works, and to sort of the level of feedback that I will get. You know, it's not like I'm there all the time listening to people, but there are discussions. I am aware of opinions. But I knew for this one, I wanted it to be quite naturalistic. There's a lot of detail in the hair. There's a lot of observation, a lot of things, you know, like kind of religious sculpture, and they would like sculpt the details inside the hand to show that level of care, that level of love for God. And for me, it's showing that level of care and love for these people who are standing, you know, at even 9 foot or 12 foot tall. You know, I want to show that we deserve love and we are loved. And I think, you know, because they're kind of disarmingly naturalistic poses at a scale which counters perhaps the vulnerability, so it doesn't create pathetic characters. You know, it allows me to kind of tweak expressions to a point where I hope people feel connected to them, and I hope people can see themselves, you know, in them and people they know. And I think honestly, you know, the feedback that's come to me so far, like, you know, I see kind of things, I try and catch as much as I can on Instagram, and it's absolutely blown my mind in terms of the way that they have resonated with all kinds of people, in terms of just feeling connected to the world and feeling, or being made aware of these human elements that we all have, these needs that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, you know, when it comes to, like, you know, visitors or the, you know, these groups from schools, you know, I love being part of that, and you know, the gallery that I show with, it's incredibly high up on their list of priorities in terms of an educational program and a community outreach, you know, in all the different gallery spaces that they have. And so for me, that's a huge bonus, because it means that I don't have to do that work. You know, we have dedicated teams that are doing that, and it's a lot of work, and it's a specialist thing in order to get the most potential out of it. And so for me, it's a privilege to be able to work with those people in order to meet people sometimes, and to actually not just talk to them about, you know, like I'm doing right here, not just to talk at them, but to actually hear their responses and kind of be educated or be made aware of the impact that these are having, so that, you know, I learned some stuff along the way, and then that often feeds into the new pieces.
Yeah. Just wanted to show this image, which gives a sense of the scale, and I feel like the scale of the works in the outdoor space and the indoor space, they have their own distinctive effects.
I mean, I love scale and what it does, and how it impacts, and how it kind of hits home on an unconscious level, almost like you can't avoid some sort of understanding, or, you know, I've called it before, like a negotiation with the object or with yourself. And there is this sort of element of status or hierarchy or understanding between scale and material, and then the people presented. And it's something, you know, the reason I use figuration is a strategy. You know, I really, my mind is in, for me, these are abstract, but they use the human form as a strategy to connect very directly to people, because people feel able to comment on the visual image of a person. And we recognize someone, or we think that looks right, that looks wrong, or they wouldn't wear that, or they would wear that, or they're this type of person or that type of person. It creates a conversation. It creates an entry point into the other concepts and the other kind of themes that are within this work. But ultimately, you know, it's about engaging people in a conversation that they might not necessarily want to have.
That's very interesting. I want to talk more about that. But I want to have these beautiful detail images of some of the works, hopefully entice some people to visit your show in LA. And, you know, just reminded, looking at these images, of what you just said about the sort of level of care and love. And I mean, I feel there is so much care and love poured into the creation of these works. And I just wanted to come back to what you have said about that, these works are clearly studied from life, and you make these digital images of real people, and yet you're very emphatic that they're not portraits. But can I just ask you directly, why is it important to you that they're not portraits?
Because I think it's important that we think about what portraits are, and I think we push it back against the sort of the thing that portraits sell us, which is that if you work hard enough and if you just do enough, you too can be valuable. You too can be respected within society. And I think it sets this this artificial bar to an entry point into being, a valued human being, to being a valued member of society. And I think as someone who grew up very aware from a young age that I was looked at and talked about within white environments in a very particular way, I need to push against that. I need to show that there's another way of being, and that is that we are valuable as we are. And as maybe that sounds kind of like too much hippie-ish or too idealist, but I truly believe it. And it's something that I've had to sort of foster within myself in order to kind of survive as a human being. And whilst I love recognizing people from history, who gets to choose?
Yeah.
There's bias built into all these systems. So we're not looking at, a detached, objective view of history. We're looking at interpretations. I have photographic work. Well, behind me on this virtual screen, this idea of narrative, this idea of provenance, of authorship, of agency. Who gets to choose? Who gets to say something's right and wrong and true and false? Yeah. And so for me, this idea of fictional characters talking about true feelings is an important angle to take on this, because I don't want, as I said earlier, I don't want people to be able to fall back on a bio of an actual individual, which is fictionalized anyway. Let's be honest. Everything's cherry picked, or Yeah. So this is about acknowledging that and going, we don't need that. Like, that already exists. So this is I'm one artist making a different option. One artist is trying to fill out a story that I think needs to be told. And for me, it's really important that I don't just fall into the same strategy or the same way of thinking as portraiture or as monuments. This is not about creating a moment of like, okay, now us, now we get to look like powerful conquerors, because that for me, that attitude, that mindset, that way of that theology is a way of creating an inequality and a way of maintaining the same structures that just exist. So if you change out who's on top, you've got the same thing. So for me, it's very important that we look at different ways of doing things and different ways of valuing ourselves, valuing each other, because that's the only way that, as far as I'm concerned, things are going to change, and hopefully change for the better, even on a small scale. If it's just on an individual, interpersonal level, the ripple effects will create within communities and with wider impact, change that I think is seriously needed. And I think, recent history or recent events is proving that more and more. And as we feel more detached from one another, I think our willingness to do bad things goes up. So for me, it's important that I don't just do a version of what already exists, but I'm trying to talk to a place that I'd like to be.
I see that. It's very clear, and maybe a nice segue into these incredible works made of pink marble. Marble being another historically loaded material. And I wondered if you wanted to say a few words about what made you venture to using marble for these larger than life heads.
Yeah, they're kind of quite large. So for me, marble has significance also because it's included as an ingredient, if you like, in one of the first sculptures I showed publicly, which is a very small bust of a fictional person on a scrap bit of wood stuck on the shelf with one screw quite low down. It's called Mixed Feelings About Bus Drivers. And I was obviously, this is 2004, I made that piece and showed that piece. And it was, there's already an awareness of what's supposed to be, the expectation, marble, a certain scale, a great individual. And so I'm already using a fictionalized character, small scale in this instance, but taking up a large space. So that inversion of expectation creates an awareness or creates a line of questioning for the viewer. But with these pieces, I wanted to embrace that material and use it to infuse this sort of otherworldliness, this luster, and the idea of beauty. I've often talked about sugaring the pill, and there's a glisten, there's a crystallized sort of gleam to these pieces that you might just be able to pick up on the forehead of the guy here. So maybe there's this idea of sort of creating these very beautiful objects, which could be plucked from history perhaps, but which tell a very contemporary story in terms of like who's represented. The idea of including all the details in the braids and the different hairstyles and the guys sort of fade and stuff like that. It's just about saying like, I see you, and here's the value, here's the moment to then be shared. And I don't know, it's like creating that connection, isn't there? They're based on a series I called Newman heads, which were aluminum heads on marble bases, and so they're very much like a Ife sort of format. The kind of the wide neck, the forward-facing gaze, but also mixed in with some ancient Egyptian kind of deity sculpture references. I was at the British Museum the other day, and I saw the pieces I was looking at initially that kind of created this journey, this aesthetic choice.
Yes.
I
see that.
I don't know, there's something about marble you can see, because it's such a laborious process, similar to bronze, but there's a all or nothing kind of element to marble, and the thing has to be released from the block. There's a romanticism attached to it, and I think tapping into that to talk about the beauty of us, the beauty of people, and then to also allow other subject matter, other more difficult realizations about society to be utilized, to be used and explored within that beautiful framework. It creates an interesting mix for me.
Yeah, I agree. I love this photograph and the expression on that young girl's face. It's like taking in the wonder of this. And I feel like the intricacy of the carving in these pieces, it kind of surpasses and takes to the next level what we normally see and expect from a marble bust. So I find that very interesting too. It makes an immediate sort of perceptual shift. So I think these are incredibly powerful. I want to just move on I want people to see some other kinds of works that you've made, and I'm just so fascinated by this piece. I feel an absolute sense of recognition of that book, and in terms of history of art, history of sculpture, and that trope of the beautiful isolated fragment photographed in black and white, interrupted here by these hand gestures and the color of your hands on the black and white monochrome pages. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what did you want to do with this work?
I guess it's kind of like these sort of serial interventions within this idea of again, I talked about this idea of official versions of history, and this idea that objects or sculptures or bits of sculptures were dug up and then were given their identities. We were told this is, I don't know, Zeus, or this is Heracles or something, and often pieces were put together from different sculptures because they were in the vicinity, so they were kind of almost like these Frankensteins. And it's not too dissimilar to my amalgams, the compositions that I create of these different individuals, and then the different techniques I use, these very traditional methods, very contemporary modern methods. But really this is about the idea of provenance and history and narrative and agency, and about, I don't really like the term, but disrupting that, of getting in there and folding pages, and then also showing an awareness and a sensitivity to the forms and to the figures, like this guy's almost like arms or wings or something like that, kind of coming at this idea of like creating layers towards the viewer, this idea of stacking depth into a two-dimensional photograph. Whilst you're talking about pages doing the same thing, if you fold a page, it becomes this three-dimensional thing. And I took these images when I was at the British School at Rome back in like 2009. And initially I was just taking works for reference, taking pictures for reference. And then I caught a bit of my thumb in one of the photos, and it suddenly changed the whole feeling of that image. The image became three-dimensional. It became charged with this contemporary reference point. And then I just sort of realized that, as you go through and we fold over a page, you want to get to another page. We're creating these, people can't see me actually, can they? But you're creating these different narratives, once you put different characters together, or for me, it was like a really liberating kind of moment of agency, and kind of confronting again these things that we take for granted, these things that we've come to accept, and showing it in a way that's slightly academic, or maybe thumbing one's nose to academia in a certain way, or the absoluteness of it, and the way that it perhaps doesn't allow for outside subjectivity.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. I've got two bodies of work that I really want to make sure we get to before we go to questions. Here we are on a very different, what feels like a very different register. But in having talked with you about these paintings, sort of understanding that in a non-figurative way, they also speak to some of the conceptual concerns that we've discussed in your work. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll try and be a bit brief for this one. So this is a painting from a series called Interoptics. And it's literally tying into some of the very first works I was making with animation. So the very first works I was using with the figure, and with the animations, it was about looking at somebody looking. So their eyes would move, they were on a black background, projected quite large, these small little plastic figures. And you would sort of be induced into believing that they were thinking about something, they were alive. But then this because they're rudimentarily sculpted, you'd be shaken out of that. So you're always kept on this moment of discovery and absorption. And with the Interoptics paintings, they're really sort of transcribing this idea of looking, but they flip the perspective. So now you're looking from the perspective of the person at where they've been looking, or as I say, where they haven't been looking. So a lot of these are about avoidance and about kind of, again, there's an interpretation. So they're not scientific illustrations of research. These are interpretations which, again, are trying to make us aware of how we look at something and how we, and what causes that. Like, why would we not look at something, or where does the eye move slowly, or why does it keep tracing over the same point? And it's just about trying to create this moment of awareness, so that the viewer takes that beyond looking at the painting. But for me, that they look very simple, but the way they're applied is quite difficult. But I like the fact that they could almost be machine done, but they're very much hand done. And so there's these imperfections which remove them from it. So like an illustration, they're not research illustrations, they're not graphs, they are paintings, but again, they're not anchored in an aesthetic journey. Like, I'm not, okay, let's put a line there because that looks nice. It's about, where's this been? And so they're sort of governed by that. And so perhaps some of them work more successfully as seductive paintings than others, but for me, it's about what was happening during these moments and what does the viewer experience whilst looking at them.
That is beautifully explained. Thank you. That's fascinating. And I want to just end with these two bronzes. And I immediately thought of Henry Moore or Jean Arp when I looked at this piece. And I wondered, sort of this biomorphism of the 1930s, abstract and yet organic, bodily. And I wondered, was that something you wanted to refer to?
Do you know what? It was something that was a little bit of serendipity. But it was, so we go to the other piece, we go to the power objects, which came first. So this was, the first time I was really exploring this idea of like visually abstract. I've been talking about these figures as being abstract, they're fictional, they're bits of different things, they're in order to create a certain psychological response, etc., etc. And people are like, yeah, but there's a person, So this, for me, this power object, section 1, number 1, briefly to describe it, the title refers to the police in the UK. It's a stop and frisk is called stop and search, and section 1 is the act under which the police can stop you in the street and search you. So this is in fact a section of a sculpture. It's a section of the groin of a figure on its side, and one of the lower sides is a pocket, and on the top is a pocket. On the back, there's a back pocket of what could be a mobile phone device or a calculator. So, and it's very much, but the texture was put on artificially. It's very textured in order to look like this sort of 20th century postmodernist sculpture type thing, you know, because it, you know, this idea of power object, is it the material that's powerful? It's Carrara marble and bronze, it's reflective, you can see yourself in it, slightly distorted, but you can see the reflection of yourself. Is it about this, the power of sculpture, the machismo of the male, you know, groin? Is it about, you know, all these things that monuments and statues are supposed to do? Or is it subject to power? Is it subject to the whim of a police officer who decides that you fit a description? So it's about how we sort of understand our society and our experiences. And then if we go back to Sonic work, this very much, this is, you know, people talk about the idea of portraits. We talked about portraits a lot. Well, this is the closest I have to a portrait, and it's a self-portrait if it is, and it's the casting of the inside of one of my ears. And then it's been scaled up, it's been scanned and then scaled up, and then presented in bronze and placed onto this bronze plate. And it very much feels like within the canon of sculptures you could see in a museum or in a book, you know, in one of the books you've just seen. But it's talking about this idea of removing the outer understandings or signifiers of identity. You know, it hasn't got my eyes, it hasn't got my face, you know, it's removing, it's not got an age or race or anything like that. So it's about talking to our desire to be seen, our desire to be understood, to be sometimes, you know, famous. But it's really, it's making visible that invisible conduit to our innermost selves, you know, if you want to talk figuratively, this idea, or literally perhaps, this idea of, you know, the sounds going through the ear and into our heads. And here is this area that we don't normally get to see, presented as this moment of almost congregation, that people can connect around it. So it talks about listening, about being heard, etc.
Oh, it's so wonderful. And I hope at least it's given people a little bit of a glimpse of the sort of the range of works that you do beyond the bronze statues or figures, sculptures, not monuments. And I wish we had more time, but I want to just for the last few minutes, I do see that there are some questions. So maybe we could just take a minute. I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see more of you. Yeah, and I've got a really interesting question from one of my colleagues, actually, Kyle Kearson, who is one of the technicians and also an artist. And he says, thank you for sharing so much about your practice. Can you elaborate on the process of 3D scanning people in the community? Would they ever recognize details of themselves in one of your sculptures?
That's a great question. It's so interesting because let's go back to, say, Hackney. Some people don't recognize themselves at all. I'm like, that's you. You stood. That's the way you stood. Like, I actually saw someone who was part of the scanning process the other week. They didn't even recognize me. So yes and no. Some people see themselves in a work that I know that they're not actually in. But then perhaps it's, you know, it's not just about the physical thing. You know, there's a lot of, the reason with Hackney, I wanted people to understand what's happening. I wanted them to inform me about their journey, their lives, so that when I'm kind of trying to create that psychological moment, they are there. You know, their story is there with me, helping guide that. And so I think maybe people recognize that element as well. But there's certainly bits of people that are very distinctive. But there's also the possibility that when you remove that from the context, you know, the whole sort of ratio of the other elements of their face, the physiognomy, it then becomes totally different. So there's been a mixture. There's people who see themselves in stuff I know they're not physically in. There's people who cannot see themselves in works that I'm like, that is glaringly you, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of it embodies you. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. And it kind of, I guess it brings up that desire to be seen, or how people feel about themselves, perhaps. You know, like, oh, that couldn't be me. You know, you know. But again, we bring ourselves to that. So if someone can't recognize themselves, I think that's quite a revealing element, perhaps.
Yeah.
To their own way of thinking. But it's, you know, it's, for me, the scanning is a very important element in terms of like creating an understanding and ownership within communities, but also, you know, that's for particular commissions, but it's also just a way that I can get physical information. You know, I used to cast things, you know, now, or take photos. Now I can do everything. So it's quite nice to have all the different tools in the toolbox.
Thank you. I have a question from another one of my colleagues, Abigail Lamphere from Paintings and Sculpture Department, saying it's fascinating to hear about your process, in particular, the issue of scale, impact, and considering viewing distances. Do you make maquettes at different scales to experience them firsthand when deciding what size to make a sculpture?
Yes and no. I normally make maquettes in order to check that stance, posture is effective, pleasing, whatever you want to call it. Is it correct? Is right? I don't know either. But obviously, you can't really make a maquette at 12 foot in terms of like to see if it works. You just that comes from experience. But I think if it works as any scale, if it works as a believable, grounded, gravity impacted human figure, which is stuff I love, you know, in terms of like the academic, when I talked about academic kind of sculpture, it's an awareness of that, like Lantari, you know, he did a series of lectures at the Royal College, like, God, 1800 something, I honestly, someone can tell me, I can't remember, but a long time ago, and there's, you know, his book's available, and I just went through, I got like 3 copies, I'd go through and I'd study it, and talk about, and read what he was saying about form and about line and gravity, and these very things that we often want to just move past, get straight to the final thing and do all the detail. It's about understanding the fundamentals of what creates really satisfying and impactful for works. And so yeah, I'm really interested in like how gravity is represented, and then yeah, again, like understanding scale. But sometimes you just have to do it, which is quite a statement to say about like a 12-foot sculpture. Like obviously that's come from an understanding. But I love the way that different scales can create different impacts and different readings of the same essentially the same piece. But if you integrate a plinth into like a 3-foot figure, it feels very different to a 12-foot piece in terms of how you navigate that, you know, and how you move around it, and that push and pull impact of scale and material. It's it's a great question. It's a difficult one to actually sort of explain articulately. But
yeah, no, I think you've explained it really well. I have a question from Nancy Ann Miller, who says, how much does the solidity of bronze affect the concept of the sculpture? There is such a gravitas in the weight of the presence of a bronze sculpture, which must influence the choice of a subject.
Yes. No. That's a great question again. So what I find really interesting is often people think that the works are solid. You know, let's go to the one end of the scale. Let's go to the extreme end. 12-foot piece. And often people think it's solid, and I love this, the kind of the conceptual impact, the conceptual resonance that material can create, can bring about. And then you can knock on it, and then you hear it hollow, and it rings in a certain way, and that creates a different effect, a different reading. And of course, you know, I use bronze because it is associated with permanence. It is associated with these sort of imposing images of very illustrious historical figures. And of course, the people I create have never existed. So it's placing those things in contrast and making us again aware of what we expect, and then actually getting us to think through what is in front of us. So the associations of power and permanence that bronze has is absolutely some of the reasons for me using them, because I want to engage in that history. I want to connect to that history so that we can critique it. But also, you know, if I get really geeky, bronze is still a very, very successful alloy when it comes to structural objects. But that's not really what I do. But I love the history of bronze and where that can take us into the future, I guess. Yeah, I really see that. And let's end with a final question from someone who didn't give their name. Where does your creative process usually originate? In current events, in past personal experience, in the stimulus of other sculptures, in music, anything else? I'm not trying to be avoidant, but I would say all of that. And it perhaps is in different proportions, different ratios throughout my career. I think at the very beginning, you know, I always have to give a shout out to my mother, who I think it was with her. She was the one that showed me, you know, or encouraged me to look and to explore the world and to find fascination, beauty, and all these different things. And she took me to the museums and gave me these early reference points and these understandings of what greatness is supposed to look at. And then as I got older, I realized that, hang on, I don't match this at all. So that sort of personal discovery was an early element or an early motivator in terms of how I was looking at the world and looking at the works. But absolutely, I reference previous works. I often say that, making a work is a conversation. You're often asking questions and trying to answer them as honestly as possible. And sometimes you only get another sort of answer after you've finished a piece. And so it's like, or question. And so another question arises. And so you make another work. And you can follow that path, and it'll take you into all sorts of places. And if you're really open and really brave, it can take you to very interesting places. So I always remind myself to try and be as open and vulnerable as possible when making works, which can be terrifying when you end up showing the works, because you're often dealing with stuff which is still quite raw and unresolved. But I think that's where the real rewards are in terms of like discovering things.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. We have to end. I feel like we could keep talking
already.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have this time with you and talk about your work. Thank you for doing this. Thanks to our audience. I'm sorry to those whose questions I wasn't able to get to, but thank you all for tuning in. And Thomas, looking forward to sort of staying in touch about what happens next in your V&A project.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. It's really been amazing, and a lot of respect for what you do. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Yeah.